Why is Africa, a continent with $45 trillion in natural resources, still plagued by poverty? Why do the richest nations in the world thrive while the birthplace of humanity struggles? Today, we uncover the deliberate systems of exploitation and silence that have stolen Africa's wealth for centuries and explore what can be done to stop this global heist. Chapter 1: The Colonial Origins of Exploitation. Africa's exploitation began long before modern headlines, in the late 19th century. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 laid the foundation for European powers to carve up Africa like a cake. Countries like Britain, Belgium, France, and Germany divided the continent, creating colonial systems that extracted vast amounts of resources for European enrichment. Take the Congo Free State, ruled by King Leopold II of Belgium, where the rush for rubber and ivory led to the deaths of millions of Africans. This exploitation, often referred to as the scramble for Africa, drained the continent of its wealth while enslaving its people under horrific conditions. But while colonial rule officially ended in the mid-20th century, the systems of control and exploitation didn't. They morphed into what we now call neocolonialism, where multinational corporations, foreign governments, and international financial institutions continue the plunder under the guise of partnerships and development. Chapter 2: The Myth of Aid and the Reality of Resource Drain. For decades, the world has been told a carefully crafted lie. Africa is dependent on aid from the West. International organizations and media push this narrative, portraying Africa as helpless, waiting for the generosity of foreign powers to survive. Here's the truth: for every dollar of aid that flows into Africa, several more are extracted through resource exploitation. Consider Africa's vast oil, gas, and mineral reserves. The $45 trillion worth of natural resources beneath African soil is siphoned off by multinational corporations, leaving local economies impoverished. Instead of aid, Africa needs control over its resources. The current global system is designed to keep African nations exporting raw materials cheaply while importing expensive finished goods. This dependency ensures that the true wealth of Africa never reaches its people. Chapter 3: The Diamond and Mineral Trade, From Riches to Ruin. Let's take the case of diamonds. Africa is home to some of the richest diamond deposits in the world, particularly in countries like Botswana, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But these diamonds, often called blood diamonds, tell a tragic story. Workers in African diamond mines face brutal conditions with little pay, while the profits from these gems enrich multinational corporations headquartered in Europe and North America. The DRC, which alone contains some of the most valuable diamond and mineral reserves, remains one of the poorest countries in the world, with a GDP per capita of just $577 as of 2023. The same applies to minerals like cobalt, essential for modern technology such as smartphones and electric vehicles. Over 60% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. Yet the wealth it generates benefits foreign companies while Congolese miners work in hazardous, exploitative conditions. Chapter 4: The CFA franc. Economic colonialism persists in more subtle ways, such as through the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries but controlled by France. This system ensures that African nations remain economically dependent on their former colonizers, with profits from their resources flowing back to France. Oil-rich countries like Chad and Gabon, despite their vast wealth, struggle with poverty because of the restrictions imposed by this system. France continues to benefit from cheap access to African resources, keeping these nations underdeveloped and dependent. Chapter 5: Silencing the Truth. What happens when African leaders or activists challenge this system? They are silenced, marginalized, or worse. Consider Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s. Sankara sought to nationalize Burkina Faso's resources, reject foreign aid, and build a self-reliant economy. His policies inspired millions across Africa. but they threatened powerful interests. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup widely believed to have been backed by foreign powers. The same story repeats across the continent. In Nigeria, environmental activists protesting the destruction caused by oil companies face harassment, violence, and even death. In Angola, whistleblowers exposing corruption in the oil industry are imprisoned. Those who dare to speak the truth about Africa's stolen wealth are often met with violent reprisals, ensuring that the cycle of exploitation continues. Chapter 6. Why the world hides Africa's wealth. Why doesn't the world talk about Africa's $45 trillion fortune? Because the richest nations, the same ones benefiting from African resources, have an interest in keeping this truth hidden. By controlling the narrative, international media portray Africa as a continent of poverty, corruption, and chaos. The reality that Africa is systematically plundered rarely makes headlines. If the world understood the scale of the exploitation, it could disrupt the global economic system that enriches a few at the expense of millions. International financial institutions, multinational corporations, and foreign governments work together to maintain this status quo. They suppress discussions about Africa's true economic power while continuing to extract its wealth through unfair trade deals, debt traps, and exploitative contracts. Chapter 7. What Africa needs to do. Africa doesn't need more charity or foreign aid, it needs control over its resources. So, how can the continent break free from centuries of exploitation? Local processing of resources. African nations must build the infrastructure to process their raw materials locally, instead of exporting crude oil, raw diamonds, or unrefined cobalt. Africa should develop industries that add value to these resources. This would create jobs, generate wealth, and reduce dependency on foreign markets. Regional unity and economic integration. No single African country can fight this battle alone. Through initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, African nations are beginning to create a single market that will allow for freer trade and greater economic collaboration. Organizations like the African Union must continue to push for collective bargaining power, ensuring that African nations negotiate as a bloc with international institutions and foreign governments. Fighting corruption and ensuring transparency. Corruption has been one of the biggest barriers to progress. African governments must implement stronger regulations, enforce environmental protections, and ensure transparency in contracts with foreign companies. Civil society, activists, and local communities play a critical role in holding governments accountable. When citizens are empowered to demand better governance, it forces leaders to act in the best interests of their people. Investing in education and innovation. The future of Africa lies in its people. By investing in education, technology, and innovation, African nations can empower the next generation of leaders, scientists, and entrepreneurs. These individuals will drive the industries of tomorrow and ensure that Africa's wealth remains in African hands. Chapter 8. What happens when Africa reclaims its wealth? What if Africa could harness its full potential? Imagine a continent where resources are processed locally, where jobs are created at home, and where profits benefit the people rather than foreign corporations. Such a shift would not only transform Africa, but would also disrupt the global economic order. The balance of power would change dramatically. Countries that currently dominate the global economy would be forced to compete on a more equal playing field. Africa, once seen as the world's underdog, would become a leader in innovation, technology, and sustainable development. But achieving this vision requires bold action, unity, and determination. Chapter 9. Unlocking Africa's future through reform and innovation. What if Africa's path to reclaiming its wealth didn't only involve taking back its resources, but also transforming the way investment works? That's exactly what's beginning to happen in places like South Africa, where bold reforms and innovative approaches to funding infrastructure projects are laying the groundwork for a brighter, more sustainable future. South Africa is actively exploring ways to attract private sector investment into public infrastructure, something that has been a long-standing challenge. For years, complicated frameworks and an absence of bankable projects kept much-needed funding at bay. But now, the government is rethinking how public-private partnerships are structured and finding ways to make these collaborations smoother, faster, and more appealing to private investors. One of the most exciting tools being rolled out is a blended finance-supported credit guarantee vehicle. Think of this as a mechanism to reduce the financial risk for private companies interested in public infrastructure projects. By making these projects less risky, the government is drawing in developers and lenders to tackle the massive infrastructure gaps across the country. For instance, South Africa plans to build over 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines within the next decade to power its future. And here's the thing. This new approach is inspired by lessons from the highly successful Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. This model is now being adapted for independent transmission projects, paving the way for private companies to play a bigger role in building the nation's energy backbone. But South Africa isn't stopping there. To make investment more attractive in the long term, the government is finalizing updates to regulations governing PPPs. By the end of 2024, new rules will streamline the process, reduce red tape, and incorporate feedback from both public and private stakeholders. This will help unlock much-needed private capital for public projects, money that can build schools, hospitals, roads, and green energy facilities. Another forward-thinking move is exploring how to transform infrastructure into an asset class. Imagine infrastructure loans pooled together into asset-backed securities, or even creating infrastructure investment trusts. These tools could revolutionize how African nations raise funds for development, particularly in areas like climate change and the just energy transition, where significant investment is critical. While these reforms are promising, it's important to acknowledge that change will take time. The journey won't be smooth. Global economic challenges, inflation, and political disagreements within coalition governments could create bumps along the way. But South Africa's commitment to reforms signals a window of opportunity not just for the country, but as a blueprint for the continent. This is the story Africa can write, a story of innovation, inclusivity, and long-term prosperity. By rethinking how resources are managed and tapping into private investment for public good, Africa can unlock its vast potential and create a future that benefits all its people. The question is, will Africa seize this opportunity and lead the way? Africa is not poor, it's rich beyond measure. The poverty we see is a result of a global system designed to exploit the continent while enriching foreign powers. It's time for Africa to reclaim its resources, its dignity, and its future. What do you think? Can Africa break free from centuries of exploitation and take control of its $45 trillion fortune? Let us know in the comments below. If this video resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into African history, culture, and economics. Thank you for watching,